Toby giggled as he waddled between the chairs, clutching a little plastic turkey almost as big as his hands. I smiled despite everything. Careful, sweetheart. He brushed lightly against my brother Ryan's chair. The scrape of wood across hardwood lasted less than a second. Then Ryan shoved him. Not a careless nudge, not an instinctive movement. A hard, open-handed push that sent my 2-year-old stumbling backward until the back of his tiny head struck the floor with a sickening thud. The room froze. Toby stared at the ceiling for one heartbeat before his face crumpled, and a piercing scream filled the dining room. I dropped my fork and rushed to him. Oh my God, Toby. Ryan didn't even stand. He leaned back in his chair, rolled his eyes, and shrugged. For crying out loud, Tilda, he said, you're being dramatic. I scooped my son into my arms as he sobbed against my shoulder. I waited. Surely someone would say something. My parents. My aunt. Ryan's wife. Anyone. Instead, silverware quietly scraped against plates again. It was as if the only person who thought shoving a toddler across a hardwood floor was wrong was me. And then I looked at my husband. Ethan hadn't moved. He wasn't staring at Toby. He wasn't staring at me. He was watching Ryan with the kind of calm expression I'd only ever seen when he was making a decision he couldn't take back. That was the moment I realized his silence wasn't hesitation. It was preparation. My mother's dining room had always been the center of every Thanksgiving. The same polished oak table. The same faded autumn centerpiece. The same promise that, for one afternoon, everyone would pretend we were the happy family we wanted outsiders to believe we were. Only this year, pretending felt impossible. Toby clung to my neck, still crying in frightened little gasps as I gently checked the back of his head. You okay, buddy? I whispered. He buried his face against me. Across the table, Ryan reached for another dinner roll. I barely touched him. Nobody challenged him. Dad focused on cutting his turkey with unnecessary precision. My mother adjusted the serving bowl without looking in my direction. Ryan's wife took another bite of stuffing. Even Aunt Denise only sighed. He's a little boy, she muttered. Kids fall. I looked around the table, waiting for someone, anyone, to say that wasn't the point. Nothing. The silence settled over the room like it had happened 100 times before. Because it had. Ryan had spent his whole life saying whatever he wanted, breaking whatever boundaries suited him, and walking away while everyone else cleaned up the damage. Growing up, whenever I protested, I heard the same sentence. Don't be so sensitive. Somehow, defending myself always became the bigger problem than whatever Ryan had done. Now my son was paying the price for the same family rule. Keep Ryan comfortable. Expect everyone else to adjust. Ryan laughed and pointed toward Toby. Maybe teach him not to run around adults. A couple of nervous chuckles circled the table. I felt something inside me tightening. Not anger. Recognition. Nothing had changed. Except this time, it wasn't happening to me. It was happening to my child. I looked toward Ethan again, silently pleading for him to say something. He didn't. Instead, he slowly placed his napkin beside his plate. Then, without taking his eyes off Ryan, he pushed his chair back from the table. The room became so quiet I could hear the chair legs slide across the hardwood. Ryan's smirk began to fade. For the first time all evening, someone else was about to take control. Ethan crossed the room without looking at anyone else. He stopped beside me and gently touched Toby's shoulder. Hey, buddy. Toby lifted his tear-streaked face. Can Daddy see where it hurts? Our son nodded. Ethan carefully examined the back of Toby's head, running his fingers lightly through his hair. He checked his eyes, asked him to follow his finger, and watched how he responded. You did great, Ethan said softly. You're very brave. Toby wrapped both arms around his father's neck. Ethan held him for a moment before handing him back to me. Then he looked me in the eyes. Any vomiting? Did he lose consciousness? No. Did he cry right away? Immediately. He nodded once. We'll still have him checked tonight. His voice stayed even. Professional. Controlled. Not once did he look back toward Ryan. That unsettled me more than if he'd shouted. Ryan leaned back in his chair with a smug grin. Can we stop acting like he got hit by a truck? Nobody answered him. Nobody corrected him either. Ethan lowered his voice so only I could hear. Has Ryan ever done something like this before? The question caught me off guard. I hesitated. Then years of memories rushed back all at once. When my cousin's twins were 4, he thought it was funny to scare them until they cried. Ethan listened. When my niece spilled juice, he grabbed her arm hard enough to leave fingerprints. I swallowed. My parents said he was just stressed. And before that, I looked down at Toby. When we were kids, if Ryan shoved me or broke my things, somehow I was always told to stop provoking him. The words felt strange coming out loud. Not because they weren't true. Because I'd spent so many years pretending they weren't important. Ethan didn't interrupt. He simply absorbed every word. So this isn't new, he said quietly. I shook my head. No. It's just the first time he's done it to your child. Those words landed harder than anything Ryan had said. Across the room, dinner slowly resumed. Serving bowls passed from hand to hand. Someone asked if anyone wanted more mashed potatoes. The normal conversation felt surreal. As if my son hadn't just been knocked to the floor. As if everyone had silently agreed the easiest solution was pretending none of it had happened. I looked around the table. My mother finally glanced at Toby. For just a second. Then she looked away. Dad poured himself more iced tea. No apology. No concern. Nothing. Ethan followed my gaze. They're watching you, he murmured. What do you mean? They're waiting to see if you'll let this go. I felt my throat tighten. I don't know if I can. You shouldn't. Before I could answer, Ethan's eyes shifted toward the kitchen doorway. His expression changed, almost imperceptibly. He had noticed something. What? I whispered. This afternoon, he said quietly, before everyone sat down. Ryan walked in carrying that stainless steel travel mug. I frowned. So, I watched him refill it from a whiskey bottle in the pantry. I stared at him. He told everyone he wasn't drinking. I know. Ethan continued watching the room. And about 5 minutes later, your cousin Melissa walked into the pantry, picked up the bottle, and hid it behind the paper towels. I blinked. She hid it. He nodded. She wasn't trying to protect the kids. He paused. She was trying to prevent another argument. Pieces started falling together. Ryan's louder than usual voice. His exaggerated confidence. The way everyone seemed strangely cautious around him before dinner even started. They hadn't been surprised by what happened. They'd been hopping to avoid it. I felt sick. They knew there could be a problem. Ethan finally looked directly at me. They knew enough to hide the alcohol. The silence between us stretched. I could already feel anger pulling at me. Every instinct told me to march across the room and demand answers. Ethan seemed to read my mind. He gently placed his hand over mine. Don't argue with him. I frowned. What? Not yet. He shoved our son. I know. His voice remained calm. But if you confront him now, this becomes a shouting match. And he'll deny it. They'll defend him. By tomorrow, everyone will remember a different version. I hated that he was probably right. So what do we do? Ethan glanced once toward Ryan, who was laughing at something Dad had just said. Then he spoke so quietly, I almost missed it. He's already made a mistake. A long pause followed. Ethan's eyes never left my brother. Now let's see who chooses to defend it. Ryan raised his glass, as though nothing unusual had happened. Can somebody pass the gravy? My father slid the bowl across the table without saying a word. Within seconds, conversation began creeping back into the room. Football. Black Friday sales. My aunt's new kitchen. It was almost impressive how quickly everyone tried to erase what had just happened. Toby sat quietly in my lap now, clutching his stuffed turkey with both hands instead of wandering around like he had before. He hadn't smiled once since the shove. Ryan noticed. He smirked. See, he's already fine. Nobody corrected him. He looked directly at me. You always make everything into a crisis. A couple of relatives forced awkward smiles. Ryan leaned farther back in his chair. That's been your thing since we were kids. I felt my jaw tighten. Before I could answer, Ethan calmly stood. No slammed hands. No raised voice. Just the quiet scrape of his chair against the floor. Every conversation stopped. He rested one hand lightly on the back of his chair and looked around the table. His eyes moved from person to person. My parents. My aunt. My cousin Melissa. Ryan's wife. Then Ryan. Finally, Ethan spoke. I have one question. Nobody answered. He continued. Who here believes shoving a 2-year-old is acceptable? The room became perfectly still. No one looked at him. My mother stared into her plate. Dad adjusted his napkin. Melissa suddenly found the salt shaker fascinating. Not one person defended what Ryan had done. But not one person condemned it either. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Ryan laughed first. Oh, come on. He waved a dismissive hand. He ran into me. Ethan nodded once. So that's your explanation. That's exactly my explanation. Ryan pointed toward Toby. The kid wasn't paying attention. Toby buried his face against my shoulder. I instinctively wrapped my arms tighter around him. Ethan remained composed. Would you mind standing up for a moment? Ryan frowned. What? Stand. Ryan laughed again. What is this, roll call? No. Ethan's expression never changed. I'd just like you to stand. The confidence drained from Ryan's face, just enough for me to notice. He pushed his chair back and got to his feet. As soon as he straightened, he shifted awkwardly. His balance wasn't gone. But it wasn't steady either. One foot slid half an inch before he caught himself on the table. Tiny. Almost invisible. Unless someone knew what to watch for. Ethan noticed. So did I. Ryan recovered quickly. What happy now? Instead of answering, Ethan looked toward the far end of the table. Melissa. My cousin's head snapped up. You went into the pantry before dinner. Her face lost color. I was helping Mom. You also moved something. Nobody breathed. Melissa glanced toward my parents. Mom immediately spoke over Ethan. Can we please stop this? Dad chimed in. It's Thanksgiving. Ryan folded his arms. There you go. He pointed toward Ethan. This is exactly what military people do. The room turned toward Ryan. You walk in here acting like you're commanding troops instead of having dinner. He gave a sarcastic laugh. You think wearing a uniform means you get to interrogate civilians. Ethan didn't react. Not even a flicker. Ryan stepped closer. What are you trying to prove? Ethan answered in the same measured tone he'd used all evening. I'm not trying to prove anything. Ryan scoffed. Sure. You already started proving it yourself. Ryan's smile faltered. only for a second. But it was enough. Ethan slowly turned away from the table. Without another word, he walked toward the hallway leading to the family room. Everyone watched him. He stopped beside the doorway and looked back over his shoulder. His voice remained calm. Let's watch what actually happened. For the first time all evening, Ryan didn't have a joke ready. No one moved at first. The dining room seemed suspended in place, every face waiting to see who would make the next decision. Then Ethan took another step toward the family room. I'm not forcing anyone, he said evenly. But if we're going to decide what happened, let's decide based on what actually happened. My father stood halfway, then hesitated. My mother pressed both hands against the edge of the table. Can't we just sit down? She pleaded. Dinner is getting cold. Ryan let out a short laugh that sounded more strained than confident. There isn't anything to watch. Ethan looked at him. Then you have nothing to worry about. The room fell silent again. One by one, chairs scraped across the hardwood as relatives slowly followed Ethan into the family room. Nobody wanted to be the first. Nobody wanted to be the last. I carried Toby on my hip while Ethan stayed beside us. Ryan remained behind for several seconds before finally following everyone else. His shoulders were stiff now. The swagger he'd worn all evening had begun to disappear. Mounted high in the corner of the room was the small security camera my father had installed months earlier after a string of package thefts in the neighborhood. I'd forgotten it was even there. Apparently, Ethan hadn't. He pointed toward it. I noticed this before dinner. Dad rubbed the back of his neck. It records continuously. Ryan immediately spoke. So what? So, Ethan replied calmly, it recorded the dining room. My mother stepped forward. We don't need to do this. Ethan looked at her respectfully. Why not? Because. She searched for an answer. Because this is family. No, Ethan said quietly. Family is exactly why we need to do this. Nobody interrupted him. He continued. Tonight wasn't one bad decision. He looked around the room. It was several. His eyes settled briefly on Ryan. Ryan chose to drink before dinner. Then he looked toward Melissa. Someone knew that and hid the bottle. Melissa lowered her head. He turned toward my parents. Others knew enough to hope nothing happened. Neither of them spoke. And after a 2-year-old was shoved to the floor, his voice remained steady. Every adult at that table protected the person who caused it instead of the child who got hurt. No one argued. Because no one could. Ryan folded his arms tighter. You don't know I was drinking. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward my father. You have access to the recording. Dad swallowed. Oh, yes. Please play it. Mom immediately shook her head. Frank, don't. My father looked from her to Ryan. Then to me holding Toby. His shoulders sagged. Without saying a word, he picked up the remote and opened the security system. The timestamp from earlier that afternoon appeared on the television. The room became so quiet, I could hear Toby breathing against my shoulder. Ryan suddenly stepped forward. This is ridiculous. Nobody responded. The recording began. There was the dining room. Everyone arriving. Coats coming off. People laughing. Then Ryan entered carrying the stainless steel travel mug. The footage showed him glance toward the kitchen before disappearing into the pantry. Seconds later, he emerged with the mug in his hand again. A few minutes after that, Melissa quietly walked into the pantry. She looked over both shoulders before reaching behind a shelf and moving something farther out of sight. She walked back into the dining room without saying a word. No one in the family room said anything either. The video continued. Everyone took their seats. Food was passed around. Toby wandered happily between the chairs with his little plastic turkey. Ryan looked down. The screen showed Toby lightly brushing the side of Ryan's chair. There was no collision. No running. No threat. Ryan looked directly at him and thrust his hand forward. The shove was unmistakable. Toby flew backward. His head struck the floor. His cry echoed through the television speakers. Then came the hardest part. The camera captured every face around the table. Mine rushing forward. Ethan standing. My mother's frozen expression. My father looking away. Melissa lowering her eyes. Ryan sitting back down, as though nothing serious had happened. And then his voice filled the room. "Relax, you're being dramatic." The recording kept playing. No one corrected him. No one checked on Toby except me. The silence on the screen looked even worse than it had felt. Behind me, I heard someone quietly begin to cry. Ryan lunged toward the television. "Turn that off." Ryan's shout echoed through the family room. "Turn that off." He reached for the remote in my father's hand. Ethan stepped between them. Not aggressively. Not with clenched fists. He simply occupied the space, forcing Ryan to stop. "Don't," Ethan said. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Ryan froze. The recording continued to play behind them. No one could pretend anymore. The screen had already shown everything. Toby had barely brushed Ryan's chair. Ryan had looked directly at him. Then he had shoved him with enough force to send him onto the hardwood floor. There was no accident. No misunderstanding. No dramatic retelling. Only the truth. My mother covered her mouth with both hands. Her voice broke. I just sat there. Tears rolled down her face as she looked at Toby sleeping against my shoulder, exhausted from crying. I watched my grandson get hurt. She couldn't finish the sentence. For the first time in my life, she wasn't trying to explain Ryan's behavior. She was confronting her own. Melissa wiped her eyes. "I'm sorry." No one answered. She looked at me instead. I hid the whiskey. I stared at her. I knew he'd already been drinking. Her words came out in pieces. He promised he'd stop after one drink. I didn't want another fight before dinner. "So you hid the bottle," Ethan said quietly. She nodded. "I thought if I took it away, we'd make it through the evening." "But you never warned anyone." Melissa lowered her head. "No." Dad slowly sank into the nearest chair. I saw him refill that mug. The confession landed heavily. I knew he'd been drinking. He rubbed both hands across his face. I convinced myself he wasn't drunk enough for it to matter. Silence. Then he whispered the words I'd waited my entire childhood to hear. I was wrong. No one defended Ryan now. Not even Ryan. He looked around the room, searching for someone to rescue him the way they always had. No one stepped forward. "You all make mistakes," he muttered. "This isn't different." "It is different," Ethan replied. "You shoved a 2-year-old. Ryan looked toward our parents. "Mom." She couldn't meet his eyes. "Dad." My father slowly shook his head. "No." Just one word. But it ended decades of automatic excuses. Ryan's face hardened. "So everybody's against me now." "No," I said. My voice surprised even me. For the first time, I shifted Toby gently higher on my shoulder. Everybody stopped being against him. I kissed the top of my son's head. I spent years believing I was the problem because I refused to accept behavior everyone else called normal. I looked around the room. I won't teach my son that protecting the loudest person matters more than protecting the smallest one. Nobody argued. Because there was nothing left to argue. That evening, Ethan drove us directly to the emergency department. The physician examined Toby thoroughly. Thankfully, he had no serious head injury, but the examination documented bruising consistent with the fall and confirmed he would need monitoring over the next 24 hours. The doctor asked what had happened. We answered honestly. Because a young child had been intentionally pushed, the hospital followed its standard procedures and notified the appropriate authorities. The preserved security footage was provided as evidence. Ryan could no longer dismiss the incident as family drama. The investigation focused on his actions that evening, including the role alcohol had played. Several relatives, including my parents and Melissa, gave statements as witnesses. For the first time, the truth existed outside our family's version of events. It existed in evidence. The months that followed were uncomfortable. Ryan stopped calling. When he did reach out to our parents, the conversations were short. The easy forgiveness he had always expected never came. He was required to face the legal consequences that followed his actions, instead of relying on the family to shield him from them. My parents began attending counseling. Not because anyone forced them, because they finally understood that silence had become a habit. Every time they had excused Ryan over the years, they had taught everyone else, including me, that keeping peace mattered more than protecting people. My mother apologized more than once. Not with dramatic speeches, with changed behavior. When she visited our home, she got down on Toby's level first. She listened instead of explaining. She stopped asking us to let things go. Dad did the same. He never tried to convince me to reconcile before I was ready. Instead, he accepted that trust would take time to rebuild. Melissa called one afternoon. I should have spoken up before anything happened, she admitted. You can't change that, I told her. I know. But I can make sure I never stay silent again. I believed her. Because this time, she wasn't asking to be forgiven. She was accepting responsibility. The following Thanksgiving looked nothing like the last one. There was no pressure to gather around the same table. No expectation that appearances mattered more than safety. Ethan carved the turkey in our own dining room while Toby, now a year older and full of laughter again, helped arrange napkins far away from any sharp corners. A few relatives joined us. Only those who had accepted accountability and respected the boundaries we had set. The house felt quieter, smaller, healthier. At one point, Toby ran across the room, tripped over his own feet, and laughed before getting back up. Every adult instinctively checked to make sure he was okay. No one rolled their eyes. No one called anyone dramatic. I caught Ethan's gaze from across the table. He smiled. Not because he'd won an argument. Because our son was growing up in a home where protecting children wasn't negotiable. As I watched Toby laugh without fear, I finally understood something I had spent 32 years trying to earn. The moment my family stayed silent was the moment I stopped needing their approval and started protecting the family I had built.